Hello, everybody. Very warm welcome. Great to have you all here for today's session. I hope you had a pleasant and restful weekend. Today, I'm delighted to welcome back the wonderful Stuart Maddocks from Clemorton Training and Development. Today's event, Leading Change, is the fourth in our series with Stuart, all focusing on leading more effectively post-lockdown and ultimately boosting productivity and sales. So I thought it'd be a good idea to briefly summarize the previous events in order to nicely set us up for today. So the first was back in September last year, and it was called Sales as the DNA of Your Business. In it, we learned about the key actions required to come out of lockdown leading from the front, relating to you as business owners, to your business itself, your workforce, and in both customer conversations and also when clarifying your expectations within your team. So in Stu's capable hands, we learn the importance of leveraging your current customer base and relationships with those who already spend with you, understanding customers' short-term priorities and needs, how to look creatively at your service offering and how this can be adapted based on what you discover about customers' needs, positioning your offering in alignment with your customers' goals and challenges, instilling a sense of urgency around the offer, developing your team's skills around selling and generating revenue opportunities, and leveraging the power of referrals. So that was a great start. The next event in the run-up to Christmas was called Lighting the Motivation Inside Your People and Customers. And this considered the commonly asked question by many small business owners and business leaders is, how do I motivate people as part of my role? And in exploring the answer, Stu looked at the nature of how people are motivated, which namely is in a unique and individual and highly personal way. So in effect, a multitude of answers to this question, whether it's a team of people or a range of clients. We looked at how to get the best out of your team and yourself, particularly during the challenging times that we've all just faced and are still facing. And we also considered what motivates customers to make changes to their buying and purchasing powers. We followed this up and very much built on that in negotiation, structuring better outcomes. That was in February, where Stu took us through how, although people do negotiate all the time without being aware of it, formal negotiation and bargaining skills can be learned through experience and through practice. We looked at why experience counts in knowing what to say and when to make concessions and when not to, and generally how to mold a situation to suit your aims, ultimately improving chances of successful outcomes. And that leads us to today and leading change. How to be the change you want to see in your business. So today, Stu's going to look at how psychology underpins both resistance and acceptance, look at building critical understanding and other skills, developing personal approaches to embracing new ways of doing things, and collaboration with colleagues, customers, and clients. Effectively, how to take people along with you in implementing change and moving forwards. So most importantly, to Stuart himself. Stuart has a wealth of experience as a trainer, mentor, and coach, special areas of interest covering all aspects of leadership and management, as well as sales, negotiation, business growth, and business model prototyping. His career spans numerous senior leadership roles, coaching and mentoring people of all ages and experience levels and skill sets, including CEOs and company founders. More recently, he's become involved in the university sector, developing faculty, management and administrative staff, and also thousands of students. So a very warm welcome to Stu, and many, many thanks for this event and the events that we've been doing. So once again, Stuart, over to you.
Thank you very much, Phil. And thanks to all of you for joining us this morning. I'm just going to spend a little bit of time making sure that I can share my screen with you. We're going to look at a number of different things today, some of which, of course, are going to be underpinned by some of the visuals that you'll see. So hopefully you can all see me now in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen with my screens up front, with my slides up front and center. We've got roughly an hour, just over an hour together in terms of some of the detail. Phil has been so kind to give me such a warm welcome and has certainly created some large shoes for me to fill. You can see some of the detail on the screen rather than me talking too much about my background and what I do. Ultimately, the reason for sharing some of this stuff with you really comes down to the fact that I've had the opportunity to see into many organizations and many businesses and try and understand the problems and the issues that they face. If you look at the bottom part in particular, in terms of the sheer numbers of people I've had the pleasure to work with, what that has generated for me is a real understanding that actually today's topic, change, is the golden thread in a lot of the problems and difficulties that we face either as business owners or leaders within organizations. So we're going to very much put that under the microscope today. I'm going to challenge maybe some of you thinking around that, but also be really interesting for me to get an understanding from the chat function here. Vicky's going to kindly help us, and Phil, I have a few questions for you. I'd like to understand a little bit more about some of the challenges that you face in terms of either innovation or change and how you go about implementing and driving that within your business, but also with your other stakeholders, including your customers. So one of the things that I'd like to kind of kick off with is, how is this going to be useful? Well, hopefully this will be useful on a number of different levels. As a professional, as an individual, so from a personal point of view, it might be able to affect not only your work life, but some other aspects of our wider lives. Phil has alluded to the fact that this is going to be centered primarily, because it's change, in the underlying psychology that exists within all of us and each other, trying to get things done more effectively when we're looking at creating or generating some changes to people's life. In the sense of work, often that involves operations and the way that we do things. So therefore, there's knock-on effects in relation to our different roles within the business that we operate. Whether it's something around being a leader within the business, within a sales function, or within an operational sense, whether it's training and mentoring other people. Ultimately, often as business owners, we have responsibility for other people's performance, our own, but also teams when we start to grow. And of course, lastly, with having FSB members at the heart of this, many of you will be business owners, and therefore it's about setting the right culture and the right brand around helping your stakeholders succeed, either working within your business or with your business in partnership. So there's a number of things that I'd like to do in order to try and help you with that. But first of all, and Vicky, I think at this point it'd be useful if we enable the chat function here. Just generally, can we just have a few words from some of you that Phil will read out to me in terms of your personal attitude towards change and innovation? If we focus generally within the business in that context, I think that would make the most sense. So Phil, if you're able, if we get any input, it'd just be interesting to see amongst the audience what people's thoughts and concepts around this are.
That's great. Okay, thanks. Please do, as we go on, please do, when Stu asks these questions, use the chat function. If you've got any proactive questions you want to ask outside that, please use the Q&A function, and I will make sure I monitor those too.
Okay, so
we have a couple of answers in. So there's two of the same kind of answer, really. What is your attitude to change and innovation? We have one answer, find it exciting. A second answer, can be motivating. And a third answer, enthused by change and innovation. So it's a motivational factor. And from Sharon Price, I believe change is, we're having a few answers here. So I'll read a couple more out and then we'll go on, and then I'll read some more out. From Sharon, I believe change is needed. I'm absolutely open to it. I think change is intriguing and necessary. A lot of positive, I embrace change answers.
Yeah, I can see that, because they're also covered up on my screen. There is a strong wealth of evidence there that suggests to me, and not surprisingly, that as business owners with an entrepreneurial mindset, that change motivates us, doesn't it? A lot of us. In fact, often the reason why we've gravitated towards doing something for ourselves is because we can dictate that pace of change and we can find that innovation exciting. Often we have people in the audience that are quite disruptive in their approach. They want to make big improvements or solve problems that other people haven't been able to solve in the way that they found satisfactory in the past. So it's no surprise to hear that generally within the comments that we've got, there's a lot of positivity around change and people embrace it, which is of course really encouraging as business owners. There's also a necessity, isn't there, when running your business, to be adaptable and be flexible enough to incorporate changes into the organization, often very quickly. If we now think about extrapolating that out onto other people or teams of people, if we're involved with them, whether it's either internally or stakeholder mapping wise, in terms of the people that we have to interact with, could be other suppliers, could be key partners, could also be the customers. It's really important to bear in mind their attitudes towards change, isn't it? How we might positively influence that. So if we take that kind of as the foundation for some of the things that we're going to discuss, is approaching it in a positive sense is really important. But we also need to be aware of the impact of these changes upon others, don't we? As well as ourselves. So there's a little picture here to the right, isn't there? Bottom right, we can see Charles Darwin, or a caricature of Charles Darwin. Often Charles Darwin is misquoted. Can you also see the quote? Can I ask you that, Phil? I'm just wondering whether the slide build is operating in the same way. Can you see?
Yeah, I can see the quote fine.
Darwin's one of the most frequently misquoted individuals in terms of evolution and change. Often people believe that his quote around survival of the fittest, which wasn't actually specifically penned by him, but they believe that, you know, certain aspects about survival of the fittest imply certain elements, and often that's strongest, intelligence, quickest adaptation are the ones that survive. Now, interestingly, actually said to the contrary. He was talking more about that adaptation, the willingness to adapt, the willingness to respond to the environments which you are in. You know, and that could be a marketplace, it could be a meeting, it could be an environment that involves technological opportunities. It's not necessarily always those people that have the biggest budget or have the biggest resource or the greatest number of people that actually are able to cope and survive with certain environments, which is good news for us as SME owners, isn't it? Being able to pivot, being able to adapt quickly, being able to alter and change what we do, but also our mindset towards change is really critical. If we take that a step further, right, we think about what change actually is. It's merely an adapted behavioral response to changing conditions. Now, when we take the scientific version of what change is and we extrapolate it onto the psychological version, unfortunately, that can become a little bit too basic and black and white. We know that the biggest issues around change are how people feel about it. You know, if you think back to some of the things that you've blocked or become defensive about in the past in your careers, often it will be a consequence of your attitude towards that specific change itself. So one of the things that I'd like to do now is think about in more detail, how do we actually approach change and what is our attitude and mindset? Because often this is shaped by the reason that is driving the change itself. So if we think about two kind of broad umbrella topics as to reasons why change occurs, these can be categorized as uncontrollable. So the things that we have to make changes about that become inevitable in our lives versus the opportunities and the opportunities to handle threats or problems that fall under the planned change banner. So let me ask you another question. At this point, Vicky, I think it's probably useful to open that chat back up. I'll be able to see some of this come through as well, Phil. So in terms of the question I have for you as a group is, what examples of forced change in your business have you experienced? I mean, there's one huge one, isn't there, which is what we've been going through for the last couple of years, was being sideswiped by the pandemic. And that's led to a whole series or a cascade of changes that have been required. But here's one. So we've got government legislation, working from home, restructuring, particularly following mergers, redundancy. Lots of things that actually we don't really get to influence that much. Brexit, I've lost 25% of my business due to that. Increased business. Main supplier going bust, really interesting one there from Teresa. These are the things that we don't get to affect, aren't they? These are the things that we don't have a choice about. But if you think about the ripple effect of that, actually, it can be quite far-reaching. Another one, technology used by the client, which is interesting, isn't it? In terms of, therefore, we have to adapt what we do in order to fit in. These forced changes can be quite far-reaching, can't they? Those examples that you've given, you've given them probably because they've had a big effect. So David's just put, again, suppliers going bust. And when that happens, we need to either pivot or change or adapt pretty quickly, don't we? We don't often have that much planning time around this. Just to give you a couple of other examples that kind of may fit in with this too. When key members of staff move on, or they decide to make a change and they go elsewhere. Now, of course, we can affect the ability of our organization to try and keep people, but ultimately the ultimate choice about whether they stay or they go is down to them. That new legislation came up, didn't it, in the example. Fashionable trends are one, often within technology, so it could come back to the point around the fact that suppliers or customers are using different technology that mean that we need to adapt, that we need to change how we deal with things. And these can be quite difficult because they're not necessarily things that we've had time enough to plan for. Yeah. If we think about those things that we do proactively want to change and that we've had time to think through, what examples do you have? And we can probably keep the chat function open here, Vicky. What examples do we have again of changes that you've planned, that you want to happen, that you are proactive about, things that you have decided can give you an opportunity to take advantage of something or perhaps to mitigate a risk? Let's just see what comes up in the chat around these. System improvements. So improving, I guess that could mean a number of things, right? Improvements to the systems that you use, improvements to the software that you use, new markets, new products. People are talking a lot in the chat now, aren't they, about flexible working and different ways of working. We see that a lot. Some people have been forced to do that, others have taken advantage of it. Improvement to contract support. So that changes, doesn't it, in terms of the resources and the expertise and the needs that we have. Outsourcing to virtual assistants, social media, so I can focus on what I'm good at. So again, prioritization of the skill sets. Somebody had downsized. Fascinating. There's lots of stuff here, isn't there, in terms of us being proactive. Who enjoys this side of their work, being able to influence and change and pivot and adapt very quickly? We heard in the initial discussion, didn't we, when I asked what your attitudes towards this was? A lot of people were saying, yes, this really motivates me. It enthuses me. It gets me going. It's exciting. It's really interesting. Now, what I'd like you to think about, right, I'm going to take a little change to the tack of this a little bit, is I want you to think about how do we actually go about doing this? And first of all, what I'd like to think about is, if you're going to be proactive and you're going to take ownership for doing things differently, like you're saying in the chat, there's lots of things that you're thinking about in terms of operational changes, system changes, people strategy, ways of working. Remember that these planned changes, particularly in startups and SMEs, often involve changing work operations for you and other people, don't they? And it's usually driven by a desire to either become more competitive or to mitigate some potential threats down the line. So in order to be more effective at that implementation of this change, we need to consider how we introduce things, don't we? Somebody wrote at the beginning when I first asked that question that communication is key. Communicating frequently and often with the people that we work with in order to minimize the impact of the changes upon them by not really giving them any surprises, which can sometimes be difficult when you're kind of backed into the corner and you have to make changes quickly. Yeah. So one of the things that I would like to ask you here is, generally, how do you go about doing it? I'm intrigued. How do you introduce change or innovation into the business? What is your approach? What methods do you use? Now, whether we answer this or whether we think about it, hopefully I'm getting you into the headspace of putting under the microscope, how do you actually drive change? What type of individual are you within the business in the way that you bring change into operations, into strategy, into the tactics that you use? So be really honest and objective here, because one of the things psychologically that underpins the way that we either accept or don't accept change comes back to a cascade that I've discussed. I've actually discussed this briefly on each of the modules that I've ran for the FSB. Somebody just put keeping an open mind, remaining vigilant, setting up and expecting change culture, all really healthy things. Share the why has just been put in there, absolutely critical. Now let me reference this in relation to how we decide as individuals. So this is a little cascade that's been observed by the behavioral psychologists that many of us share and have in common. This is something called zero order or baseline change, which essentially is how do we as individuals in isolation decide for ourselves whether change is necessary or not. So just follow this through for me, please, right? I want you to think about this cascade, about how we go about deciding whether we should or shouldn't do anything differently. First of all, as you can see, number one, we become aware of something or we are made aware of something. And that usually is the nucleus of the idea that generates us to think about why we should try something differently. So let me try and give you an example. A real simple one. If I had a hole in my shoe, right, I would probably become aware of it because of the physical situation, wouldn't I? If I walked out to go to a meeting, it was cold or it was wet, I would become aware of it. The second step naturally is then what I do is I go inside myself and I ask, if I ignore this and I stay happy with the status quo, as in how things are now, what happens? Does that end up being good for me or bad for me? And I evaluate the answer to that question. And I say to myself, is it good? Is it bad if I do not change? You can see in number 4, what we then say is if we come to the conclusion that actually not changing is good for me, I don't need to do anything differently. I don't think about doing anything differently. In fact, the way I've articulated it there is we just go on our merry way, don't we? We carry on doing what we were doing. Now, the interesting second part to that sentence, and more to the point in terms of change and resistance, is that if we think everything's going to be fine if we just carry on, we'll resist change, particularly anything that anybody else tries to impose upon, because we've determined for ourselves independently that we don't need to do anything differently. Now think of where this has ramifications or implications for us as a business owner. It really matters in terms of our employees, doesn't it? It really matters, because if they think in their mind that they don't need to do anything differently, then that's a problem for us if we want to make some changes. It's also a real problem when we have customers that don't see the need for altering or changing either what they buy, what they use, what service they procure, because they haven't got to the point in their mind that has said that actually there's a requirement for change. Let's go back and let's stick on ourselves for a moment. Let's move on to number 5. If I decided, go back to the original example, if I decided that having a hole in my shoe is bad for me, I would now start to think and believe strongly that I had to make a change around that, wouldn't I? I wouldn't necessarily know what the answer or solution to that problem was yet. I'd have merely identified in the forefront of my mind that something has to change about this. I now know that I need to do something about it. That energy alone that I now have for doing something differently about it is absolutely critical to the power of driving change and innovation. Because I'm now sat, aren't I, in my proverbial ivory tower or my office, having been convinced by the evidence that I've seen or the data or the information, in this simple example, the fact that my sock got wet, that I need to do something other than what I am doing, which is wearing a hole with a shoe in it. So now what I do is I very quickly go into that ideation or creative thinking mode of what solutions could I come up with to solve that problem. So I create that list of possible responses, don't I, in number 6, and I go, okay, option A, option B, option C, etc. I come up with hopefully a number of different choices. If this only affects me, often what I'll do very quickly, and I don't know about you, but I find a lot of business owners do that reasonably quickly. You know, they're quick thinkers. We know our environment, our marketplace, we know what we're doing, and we say, right, okay, out of those options, I'm going to use my analytical ability, and I'm going to come up with the best one out of those, usually pretty quickly. I think I'm going to do B. It's the best option for these reasons. And then I move on to 8 and I go straight ahead and I implement it. Now, that's not really a problem when it's just affecting me. If it was holding my shoe, it doesn't really affect anybody else. It's a decision that I should make and take, and I can get on with it. Of course, now I guess most of us in the audience are thinking through, all of my decisions don't just affect me, they affect suppliers, they affect customers, they affect my colleagues, they affect my co-founder, they affect people in my team or my management team if I'm growing and I'm a bit bigger and I'm on a scale-up journey. So actually, making decisions for myself is not the issue, it's when I start to affect other people. So if we think about what happens now when we start to affect other people, the understanding that we have around this cascade should inform us of what we need to do in terms of approach. So a lot of people have talked in the chat about collaboration, involvement, answering the why, getting people to understand the rationale that we have behind our decisions, which is fundamentally the right approach. But what this shows us is how we need to go about doing it. The last thing we need to do when we are affecting other people is decide that we're just going to push on with something if it's going to have a big impact on others, and if we have the opportunity to genuinely collaborate with them. So if we change that slide and we put number 8 in red and we say to ourselves, here's the risk. The risk is that we do the same thing regardless of whether it affects others or not. Think about what happens if we went through the same cascade. We did it in isolation on our own, which is fine if we're a sole individual and it doesn't affect others, but usually it will affect customers or suppliers or partners. Is the last thing that we should do is use exactly the same approach, particularly when it affects others in a large manner or in an impactful way. What we need to think about doing, isn't it, is using that to our advantage, that understanding, and saying, okay, so where, and this is called first order change now, where it affects other people, right? With the knowledge that we acquired when we went through that process in our minds, we do a similar thing, but the process is distinctly different in that the manner in which we target the questions is more to the other people that are involved. So we go to ourselves, we go to our team, don't we, if we've got a team, we go to our stakeholders, we make and create the opportunity to inform them of the something that we became aware of. We think through what levels of information they would need to have clarity on the evidence that we had access to. And then we ask them a similar bank of questions. We ask them what would happen if we ignore this, and we ask them whether that's good or bad for us. Now, this is one of the major blockers in terms of true collaboration for senior leaders or founders in any organization, is that this represents a point of risk. The point of risk is that people will decide contrary to what we believe. And that is usually a consequence of either a fundamentally different viewpoint or inadequate information that's been presented in a way that allows them to see the fact. Or a third option, which is that the senior leader or the founder has got it wrong and this genuinely isn't as big a problem as we thought. So sometimes there can be a little bit of toing and froing in terms of the communication around getting it clear in other people's minds that staying the same is not really an option. So when we're able to communicate that evidence and when we can help people see that there is a requirement for change, that's when we start to get people truly understanding that energy needs to be put behind deciding what happens next. But that creates another point of risk, because if we think about what solutions they might come up with, generally they're not always going to be exactly the same idea that we had, are they? And this therefore presents another problem to us, which is a point of risk, which is it's unlikely that their solution or answer is going to 100% match what we decided. It's very, very rare. And if that happens, we may have steered it and been too leading. It's equally unlikely, however, that it will have absolutely no commonality in terms of the solution that other people come up with, because you've probably got some overlap of experience, understanding, or expertise. That's why they work within the business. And the most likely outcome is that it's probably going to be some sort of hybrid. The beauty of the hybrid option is that actually it makes you more robust, doesn't it? Taking on board other people's considerations and thoughts makes you more robust in terms of that constructive challenge element. So we then need to disassociate our ego from the solution that we came up with. Otherwise, we end up having a problem. We end up having a problem in that we want our solution to be the solution that gets implemented. And that's when we can again get real difficulty getting people psychologically to come on board with the idea that we have, because we get too closely fixed to the detail of the idea. So if we move that on again, another step, the danger therefore exists in that we get too closely attached. Our ego becomes entwined with our solution or our answer to the problem. And now we have a belief that our whole job is to convince or persuade people that what they need to do now is understand that our way is the best way. So where you have an opportunity to collaborate, you have to genuinely dive in wholeheartedly into full collaboration. We can't play a game, can we? We can't choose to pretend like we're trying to involve people, but already have our solution sorted out, because that becomes a game. I've been involved with certain change management scenarios where that's happened, and the whole thing starts to fall down around you if you have a pre-prepared idea when you've gone through an engagement process. By all means, you should have input, but you should have input at the stage of deciding which is the best way to proceed. But often what happens is that we ask for input, but we've already got our plan and it's very, very clear, and people can see that there wasn't as much authenticity in going through that process. Now, I'm not saying that you take that approach. In fact, from what I've heard in a lot of the chat input, people are acutely aware that this is the case. I think it's really important to have shown you that cascade, because psychologically we all do that naturally and we go through it reasonably quickly. Yeah. Okay. So let me just ask in the chat, in relation to going through that process itself, fundamentally asking the question and answering it effectively with people about why. What does that give to teams and people that are going to go through a change process? A lot of people have said focus on why. Why would you focus on why? Can we open the chat function again, Vicky? Why should we focus on answering this question? In your own words. Have you got anything, Phil? Empowerment, okay, it's coming through. Understanding, yeah. Understanding all the issues. If they don't understand, they may be scared. That's a really interesting one from Wendy. Yeah. Buy-in, understanding from everyone. Purpose inspires, it does. It does, yeah. Clear direction so that people can head and all kind of row off in the same direction, which is great. Engagement and ownership, absolutely. So these things are, to me, fundamentally are driving, aren't they? The energy that's required to pivot or to adapt. You know, people can only embrace the new if they are motivated and up for it, because often that change is difficult, isn't it? Particularly with things like behavioral change, really difficult. Usually easy in terms of the detail of the change, but difficult to implement. Managers tend to tell, absolutely. There's a couple of those elements that are going to be highlighted in the next few slides, actually, interestingly enough. And it's to do with the impact, isn't it, that these changes have on people. And often what happens at a senior level, whether it's a founder or a business owner or someone within a management team, they often assume, don't they, that people are capable with immediately pivoting or changing or adapting. Often people in senior positions have got better at doing that over time. But it's not always easy to cope immediately, particularly if it means an adaptation to the way that we're working. And we should expect to some degree that people naturally are often very good at seeing the negative, aren't we? We can see how it's going to impact us. We can see that it's not going to be great. And what reasons it's not going to be great for. In actual fact, the point that somebody made before about the fear element is an interesting one. So we shouldn't we, as business owners, expect a reaction from our customers, from our people, from our teams, from our stakeholders, from our suppliers. There's going to be a reaction, and sometimes it's going to be negative, which is not necessarily what we're looking for, but it's a natural response. And when we think about the flip side of this, so yes, we see threats, but there's a positive, isn't there? There's an opportunity, and those opportunities might take a little longer to sink in, but we have to get adept and good at articulating those opportunities and benefits at the right time. The timing of that can be important, because if somebody is thinking about the potential negative repercussions of change, they're not that receptive to the positive reinforcement of the benefits, because all they're thinking about is, oh, that's not good for these reasons, and that's occupying their mind. And sometimes what we do is we cloud that by trying to sell the idea at the same time as people processing it. We should give people an opportunity to process the potential change before we reiterate the benefits, yeah? Because we come back to the fear, or the people are being scared. It's not the change itself. And again, the psychologists have looked into this deeply. It's not that people are afraid of the actual changes. So let's take something, somebody said before, systems or process changes. You know, if I had a weekly report form that I was used to filling in within the business, if somebody changed the software that we used or the formatting, I wouldn't necessarily be against the new software or the form change, but there would be some type of associated loss in the back of my mind that would generate or create fear, or me being scared about that new way. So let's just consider that for a moment. What sort of things do or can people become afraid of or worry about? What is it that people might stand to lose? So let's open up the chat again, Vicky. I'm interested in this in terms of what could people fear? What could the loss be within any given change? What would you type into the chat box for that? I've got a few thoughts. Here we go. From James, status, a couple of status. Management of time, their job. Yeah. Loss of familiarity. Absolutely, Teresa. Their livelihood. Worried that skills are not up to date. Control, we can all see this, yeah? Maybe an additional work or loss. Responsibility. Relationships, yeah, from Si, really important. Now, you've got to think about the spectrum of people that we work with. We can be similar, but also very different, can't we? Now, if we think about some standard areas that these would fall into, and they encompass the ones that you said, is it could be this, couldn't it? It could be the threat, could be the loss of security that comes with that decision. So that framework that I felt was safe is now changing, or even my perception of the safety of it changes. It means I might lose some control, which could be about whether I keep my job or not, or it could be around status. These are very real concerns that people have. And particularly in the workplace now, which generally, you know, if I think back to my own father, who's in his 80s now, the deal that he did with his employer when he kind of left school or college, when he finished his education, the deal he had was he would swap his loyalty for security. That deal doesn't always exist in quite as plain view today. People move around a lot more. Security isn't quite as deep as it was. You know, the level of ability to feel secure with organizations can be a little shallower than it was at some point in the past when larger organizations dominated. We have a lot of more small and medium-sized enterprises now, And as a consequence, it's difficult sometimes because of competitive market forces to predict whether we're going to be around in 10 years or not. So obviously that changes, but when people make changes in the way that we operate, it can ask us to question the security of where we are. It can also, can't it? Somebody put there about the skills to do the job, didn't they, in the chat? That change, and this is particularly pertinent for people that have got competent around certain areas within their job. That can be people that have been in the job for a long time, or it can be people that pride themselves on their level of capability, which hopefully is most people that you have. Can I cope with this new way? If we're bringing in new technology or software or processes, how long will it take me to learn that? If I am exposed as being incompetent in comparison to other people that work within the business, what does that now say about me? That can then link back, can't it, to feelings of security. So it can almost be like a cascade. It can be difficult for people to deal with each of these as individual issues or feelings. Another one could be relationships. Somebody put that up in the chat. It often means working with new people or different people, or not working with the people that we used to before. Now, we know, of course, one of the big things in organizations is trust and levels of trust, and whether we can trust people to do a good job and keep things to themselves, and how good a relationship do I have with people in relation to knowing what they can do and what I can do. And that creates a problem. You know, if you think back to periods in your past in your career, even having a new manager or a new leader for anybody means now we've got to get back on the treadmill of building the trust and competence understanding between the two of us. Those types of things are really key for people. People that are driven on relationships, this is going to really affect. You might be somebody that isn't, but we need to think about it from other people's perspectives, don't we? Yeah. So loss of relationships. About this one, this has happened a lot, hasn't it, recently with COVID, hybrid working, change of working circumstances, downsizing, moving offices, ultimately taking away fixed desks, going to hot desking, all sorts of things have happened in the work environment. You know, we're territorial. A lot of us are territorial in terms of wanting our own space, being used to the environment that we work in. You know, this goes back to, you know, hundreds of thousands of years ago. Yeah. It's really, really interesting, isn't it? Where people get moved and then they have a response. I had one client who used to run an insurance company in Glasgow, and within that insurance company, historically, they'd had the same office for about 15 years, and it was above the shops in the city centre. What actually happened was that leader, that business owner, decided to take advantage of tax breaks, new infrastructure, new technology, better wireless, internet, and moved out to a satellite business park. Now, within the makeup of that employer's people, 60% of them have been with him since the start, which is a lot of people to have known that city centre working environment. And when they changed, about 30% of those people left within 6 weeks, because actually the environment was so different. Their working day was so different. They didn't have access to the things that they used to have access to. It fundamentally changed their ability to deliver for their customer, because that individual hadn't necessarily thought through all the ramifications of making that change. And as a consequence, that business suffered for about 2 years trying to re-recruit because of that positional difference from where location-wise they were used to being in the city centre, and now they weren't able to get buses in, had to drive in, a lot of considerations and knock-on effects. Another example could be loss of purpose, couldn't it? As we change fundamentally what we do, people tend to ask, why am I doing this? What's the aim of the job that I've got? It's not why I joined here. I'm sure probably some of you in the audience have left places because of that very issue or that very fact. Fundamentally, purpose and connecting people to purpose is really important. So strategically, when you're making bigger choices about the business and how you're operating and what you're going about, and in terms of your mission and your vision, remember it's going to have an effect on those purpose-driven individuals. Loss of lifestyle. Again, this links back into that example I gave you in Glasgow. Being close to certain things will mean a lot. Amenities, having a certain lifestyle around work. A lot of pushback now about going back into the office is because people have got used to certain ways of living, haven't they? And it's about ensuring that we keep the right things for the right reasons and go back to the other things that are important for the right reasons too. And getting that right as a business owner can be really tricky. So part of what we need to think through are the ramifications or impacts of even small changes that we're thinking about implementing. So when we do this, we've got to be cognizant and very mindful of the fact that other people in the organization and ourselves are going to go through a grieving process for the old way. Now, what that means is that we need to think about communicating the opportunities so that people can get future focused in the right way for individuals to have that personalized. So opportunities are wide, aren't they, when change comes in? Here's some examples of them. Opportunities, people mentioned status before, opportunity for development, opportunities for higher status. People like to wipe the slate clean, you know, when other people come in, when leadership changes, it's an opportunity for a fresh start. They're extremely motivating. The threat parts are demotivating. So we need to think about what our narrative is, how we articulate the benefits. But interestingly, we need to think about what this will mean to each individual. So those of you that were part of the last module that I ran, and Phil talked a little bit about it being around motivation, we've got to try and understand what the good in each of the changes might be for each of our people. So we need to think about it from their perspective, not our own. And the way that we do that is by considering how they may react. Now, any of you that have been involved in change management and have looked at some of the theory that underpins this will know that the grieving process and the change response are very similar, and they're mirrored in many ways. There are 4 stages to how people go through change, and that creates what's called a change response curve. So the first stage is surprise and denial. The second stage is resistance. The third stage is confusion. And the last stage that we're trying to get people to is acceptance. Those phases have an effect upon their individual performance right the way through this curve. So let's just have a look at it in a simplified way. The responses to change will have an effect on overall performance. So if you look to the left of this, this graph of this chart, if we imagine that the status quo is happening before we get to the start of the box, what happens when we first announce or people become aware of the change? They enter into this first phase, which is called surprise and denial. Look at what happens to performance. It immediately dips. Now, the speed at which it dips will often be related to the impact of that change. But that dips and it goes down and it plummets during resistance. It ends up bottoming out in the third stage, which is called confusion. We'll look at each of these in turn in a moment. And ultimately, what we're aiming to do by introducing or bringing in any change is to improve overall performance for the business, isn't it? So if you look at this graph and chart closely, you can see that the right-hand side after acceptance is subtly higher than the left-hand side. We do implement change with the view that we're going to improve performance overall, but it takes time. And the speed at which people move through that change progress curve is very individual, isn't it? Like grieving is. So if we look at some of the detail in each of these phases, so if we take surprise and denial, we think about this stage in particular, there are certain behaviors, there are certain things that you see at this stage when people are in here, right? So when you first announce it, people can behave in many different ways. They can withdraw, they can be indifferent to it. They can avoid things, can't they? If they're in denial, they can avoid it. They can be in disbelief and they can say things either to us or to each other or behind the scenes, like, it'll never happen. They've talked about doing this before. All we need to do is get on with our work and carry on, and we won't see this, it won't affect me. You know, and then you get that passive resistance. The difficulty about the passive resistance is that people look like they're going to embrace the change, but they just carry on doing the old way. And that's really damaging for a small business because we have limited resource generally as it is. So during this phase, the symptoms to look out for as a business owner in terms of being vigilant and being disciplined in what you are trying to observe is that you will see a general feeling of apathy at this stage. There won't be people shouting negatively about it yet. There'll be this business as usual mentality. but people don't get as much accomplished. And it's really important that during that initial phase, you don't mistake the business as usual to be acceptance, because people will be moving often quite quickly, even immediately, into this second phase of resistance. And this is where we get problems. This is where we have to actively become involved in conflict management and dealing with people's negative responses to that change. So we see things like anger, hostility. People use rose-tinted glasses and say how it used to be. You know, they use that, glorifying the past attitude of how good it was before this came in. People become unwilling and you don't get as much done. People attack the plan or the idea, and it can become quite toxic and a quite friction-based environment. It can be difficult to manage, and it's really important that we get involved at this point, isn't it? And surface differences of opinion. We kind of need to go in and hit the wasp's nest, don't we? Pick the stick up and hit the wasp's nest so that we can understand how people are feeling. Otherwise, we won't be able to work through it with them. So at this point, we need to look symptomatically at where we get reduced or lack of productivity, where we start to have some of the major issues that we can face around people blaming others, blaming you as the formal leader or owner. Anger comes out. People can go off on sick with stress. People can withdraw and come away from the activities. People can genuinely have some mental health issues, and we need to be mindful of how we deal with that in a sensitive manner. So resistance is a real damaging phase for people and for businesses. And we need to think about how we get people through this. So you bottom out in terms of performance, in terms of your mental approach to things when you get into this confusion stage. And often confusion is caused by either complex changes or difficult implementation plans, where the new way is vastly different than the old way. So what people start to do now is they start to take risks. They become active, they have more energy, they try things out, but they get impatient, they get frustrated, but they have a more positive response. They're forward looking. So if you look towards acceptance, they're now gazing down the tunnel towards where the light might be. And they're saying things like, well, what if we try this? What if we try this? Let's try that. It can only get better. How do I get involved? What was the change? What was the new way? And what they're looking for is support, training, reiteration, clarity, motivation, and help. So it's at this point that we really need to get involved as business owners, as helping those people through this curve to acceptance. And you might do that through using other people in the business. You might use subject matter experts. You might use mentors. You might use people that are further on in the curve and who've got to acceptance and now are starting to see genuine, real, live benefits of using or doing the new approach. There's nothing more powerful, is there, than having people who do similar jobs to you, giving you examples of benefits, why this works. Utilizing those people that are through the change is a really strong way of doing this, because ultimately that will be how you convince others that this is worth doing, because those that have already gone through it know what it was like when they were stuck in resistance, but also know what it's like when they're in acceptance. Another aspect of this, right, is to think through what might actually happen during confusion. This is the stage at which some people might start to get a bit political. They might utilize and leverage their relationship with certain people to make ground or step ups for themselves. So be aware of it. People will backstab. People will try and take advantage of opportunities that exist by being on side behind the change. So this is where we need to be vigilant and look out for it. Hopefully you don't have many people in the organization that operate like that, but change often brings that out in people. So be mindful of trying to manage that situation and deal with it effectively. But look for enthusiasm, look for ideas, look at getting people on board as quickly as possible. Now, let me ask you another question here. This is more rhetorical. Who dictates the pace of how quickly people move through this curve? Because ideally what we want people to do is embrace it, isn't it? We want to support them through this confusion phase, but we want them to get to that acceptance. We do that by chunking it up, making it simple, having clarity, making people aware of the small steps. Let's talk about what we need to do by tomorrow or by Friday, not what we need to do by the end of the summer or Christmas. because if we get too long range during confusion, it's difficult for people to grasp onto progress. So chunk it up, make it easy, help people get to acceptance. Remember, who dictates that pace? It's them, not us, right? It's them. It's the other people. It's the other side of the equation. What we're looking for longer term is cooperation, future orientation, confidence, people taking initiative, being behind it and being energetic, listening out for the positive signs of how can I contribute, what can I do, we can do this better. People actually, when they walk into that light at the end of the tunnel, now know and fully appreciate what the benefits are. And hopefully, if you've thought it through well enough and strategically you've made the right choices, the world now is going to be a better place for you in the way that you operate. And the thing to look out for, Symptomatic, is keenness, cooperation, and you can now focus your energy and your time and your effort on task accomplishment, which prior to that, it was more about trying to deal with differences of opinion, dealing with conflict management, trying to encourage people to be open. Now you can really attack the task and go for the new system, the new approach, the new way to get that level of performance that you wanted, which was the whole reason why you decided to do something differently in the first place. You know, if you bear in mind very much with those people that the speed of that transition from surprise and denial will be based upon a number of factors, right? The level of information that they get given, so that rationale about why, their level of involvement and collaboration in the change. So we go back to that cascade, asking them, seeking opinion, trying to get them help you come to the solutions that you will implement. It also depends upon gains and losses. There are online lots of different versions of something that is called a change impact assessment sheet. And a change impact assessment sheet is a good tool to use as an owner or as a senior person in the business, because it makes you think about the gains and losses potentially for each person, for each team, and for the organization as a whole. So perhaps maybe just do a little search on that after today. Change impact assessment sheet helps you think about the gains and losses. Now, it's only ever going to be a best guess for an individual, isn't it? Hopefully we know our people well, but it's sometimes difficult to know exactly how they're going to feel about every change or pivot. But thinking it through will at least give you a head start over not having thought it through at all, which sounds like common sense. But as we know, unfortunately, when we're busy, common sense doesn't always come to the fore. We want to press on, we want to implement, we want to go live, we want to do the new way because we know the benefits, because we've sat and we thought it through. The third one, which is really important, of course, is attitude, isn't it? Personality. Some people we know don't accept change as readily as others. And actually what we're looking for, particularly in startup environments, are people that are willing to accept that change and actually embrace it like we do, which comes back to recruitment, doesn't it? It comes back to who am I recruiting and why am I recruiting them? Is it a reasonably good cultural fit as well as somebody having competence and the right attitude? So we'll have to consider really genuinely when we promote or when we bring people in, when we've got small numbers, the power of that small number and how attitude affects things. Here's something to bear in mind. I've worked on a lot of change management projects with a lot of clients, some of which are very large organizations. And often what you find when they've got a lot of resource in a company, which isn't necessarily SME owners, but what you find is they put together some sort of change management group. Now, the reason why I mention this is even for SME owners, this is important. If there's 1, 2, 3, or 4 of you, you can often have very different views on that particular change. And a mistake that I see made on selection for change management groups is they try and choose all the people that are positive and behind the change. Now, I understand the rationale. They're trying to convince and motivate others to do something differently. However, what they don't always get is a true appreciation and understanding of what barriers exist for the people that are negative about that change. So this still has an impact on really small companies, because it's easy, if there were 3 of you, to focus on the person that's positive. It's easy to ignore and brush under the carpet the differences of opinion or people who are negative and try and focus on the positive. Remember that we won't get over the negativity until we deal with it. So ask the questions, involve the people that have problems with it, try and understand why, and then collectively try and deal with it in a way that means that they can turn the corner on their negative thinking into understanding why it's going to be important and how it's going to benefit them. That makes sense? Hopefully. Yeah. Okay. So it's 12 o'clock. I'm conscious that I'll always be forgiven for perhaps finishing a little early rather than finishing a little late. But I want you to genuinely think about the last hour. What has this meant for you in terms of action planning? Because we've all sat, haven't we, on various virtual forums over the last 2 years. We've heard a lot of people talk about a lot of really interesting and helpful stuff. How helpful it becomes is usually down to the actions that you decide to take as a consequence. So the one thing that I always encourage, and Phil and Vicky will both know this, and those of you that have seen me before, is what are you going to do differently as a consequence of having spent an hour of your time thinking through how you deal with change and innovation in your business? If you don't action plan around it and you don't do something differently, effectively you've just spent an hour of your time that could eventually be wasted. And the last thing I want for you as small business owners is to waste an hour of your day, because I know how important it is. So what I'm going to encourage you to think about is, what do I therefore do next, right? And in terms of things that you do next, pulling that together, I have a couple of things for you to think about. So action-wise for you as an individual, whether it's as a senior person or the owner, is make sure that you're clear about your own approach. How do you introduce it into people's lives? And how might you adapt the approach that you take based on what we've talked about today? If you feel that there are approaches within your business, including how you deal with things, do you need to have professional and appropriate conversations with others in order for you collectively to be more effective? The third aspect is really understanding that cascade and the drive for people to be involved, to be empowered. People put empowerment up in that chat box a lot. True empowerment comes from being involved, doesn't it? Feeling like you've had a say in what's going to happen. There's nothing more motivating in getting some of your ideas accepted, because you will drive that much quicker than anybody else with more energy and more passion. Don't have the go live date for your idea be the thing that prevents you from truly collaborating. Make sure that people are energetic, enthused, and positive about the changes that you're going to implement, which usually comes down to your level of engagement and your approach. But only do this, and you'll see point 4, when that approach is going to be genuine and the decision has not already been made. If that decision is up to you and you're going to make it and take it, this is going to be a directive, isn't it? Yes, with rationale, but it's going to be something that you are rolling out. It is not going to be something that people can affect. So therefore, you need to think about which one of those it is and what approach to take. Now, I know there's a lot more to change, right? I used to run a 3-day change management program at University College London with business owners, and we went into so much detail. I've had an hour today. I'm hopeful that even by skimming the surface, it's made you think. If I can be the catalyst for you as a business owner today to implement one thing differently, right? It's been worth my time. If it's more than one, it's been a good day. So I want you to think about what you're going to do, and I want you to try it out. You know, if you don't embrace this approach and you can embrace it more or even more effectively, then start it this afternoon. Have some lunch, go back, make some changes. Good luck. Thanks for your time. Phil, I'll hand it back to you.
Stuart, yet again, that was absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. Big virtual round of applause for Stu. So much packed in, as you say, you only had an hour, but so much packed in, I think, and so much to learn. Please do, if you have any questions for Stu, can you pop them in the Q&A box now rather than the chat? We do have one at the moment, and that's from Lawrence Jones. And I think the essence of what he's asking is, how do you approach it when it's a manager, when it's the person that you need to be leading change, who is the one who is displaying that resistance, maybe fear of losing the job? You know, what's a good idea of how to get them on side?
Okay, so when it's the actual manager who's responsible for the implementation of that, and they're the one that are resisting, yeah. Well, if you think about the process that we've just kind of talked through and the approach, it's absolutely critical you take the manager through that prior to giving them the task of rolling it out. Because if you think about what we're talking about with getting people to acceptance, it might well take time. You can involve them in the rationale and the understanding around how you made and took the decision. Often the answers to those questions will allow them to turn a key in their mind that number one, they understand why. So that's fundamental. Number two is, what was your thought process and what evidence pointed you towards making and taking the decision that you have? And number three, what's going to change and be more positive for my people about the outcomes that we will achieve after we subsequently implement this effectively? There's an additional thing I'm going to point out here, Phil, is if a manager is concerned or worried naturally about whether this will mean losing their job, if you think about what the right thing to do is in terms of leadership, often being honest and truthful with a manager well prior to what the potential consequences could be is going to be what you need to do in terms of your well-being aspect around that person's place within the organization. I think hiding the risks or the problems that people might encounter is probably not the right thing to do. I get that operationally you may make different decisions and choose to announce things further down the line. My challenge back about that, and I'm not saying that's what you've done, right? But my challenge back about that is a rumor or a person's belief and perception that something might happen is just as damaging as a factual piece of information. So when you think about energy behind change, if somebody believes that something may occur, then the onus on the business owner is to either quell that worry quickly with fact and let them know that that's not happening, or share the information that it either could be happening and how, as quickly, as honestly and as transparently as possible, so that that person can operate in the right way. If they genuinely are at risk of losing their job, then you also need to think about, you know, the fact that you need to do the right thing in terms of giving the opportunity to plan themselves for what that might look like if it's a transition out of the business. If that fear is unfounded, then you need to let them know that that fear is unfounded. So again, it's all back to what a couple of people put before. It's effective, consistent, considered, fair, objective communication.
Thanks, Stu. That's a really detailed and hopefully helpful answer. I hope that's helpful, Lawrence. We have no more questions, so just leaves me to say what a journey we've been on these 4 events. I personally feel I've learned so much, and I know from the feedback from other people that that's the same. And what a time to do this as well, given the difficulties we've faced and that we're still facing up to really support business owners in leading from the front, ultimately to drive the business forward, take their staff and the customers with them, but ultimately to grow that business and implement change in that way. So just a massive thanks yet again to Stuart Maddocks from Clemorton Training Development. Thank you so much. Please do watch this space. I hope anyway, that we'll be back with Stu in the future for more of this, maybe online, maybe physically, maybe both. But thank you to Stu again. And thank you to everyone that has attended today. I hope and trust that you got some real value out of that, as with the other events that we've done with Stu. So wish you all a profitable, peaceful day. And we'll see you again soon at the next one. Bye now.